Good morning. Well, good evening to you.
Yeah. Good morning.
Hello, everybody. Good evening, all participants.
Okay. Whenever you want to start, we can start.
Let us start, Professor. It's 6:04.
Yes, sir. We can start.
We'll start. People will join. People are joining.
Yes, sir. People are here.
Okay, so good morning, everyone. Well, good evening, everyone. Today and tomorrow's sessions, I was asked to talk a little bit about constitutional law and economics. So we're changing the subject here of our conversation. And my plan today is the same as yesterday. So we'll talk a little bit until a bit before the break, do a break, and then come back. And of course, questions are welcome. Tomorrow, unfortunately, I do need to finish a bit earlier because I do have another conference call that overlaps with this one. Very busy month, August. Shouldn't be, but it is. Well, constitutional law and economics. Let me start with a few remarks. First, unlike criminal law and economics, or most of the common law and economics, there is no clear seminal paper in constitutional law and economics. And in fact, it's a very diffuse area of analysis, unlike the others that are very well clarified. So we all know that criminal law and economics started with the Beckett paper. We know that property law and economics goes back to Coase. We know that contracts and torts goes back to Calabresi's book and then Posner's book. And same with civil procedure. But constitutional law and economics is sort of a more diffuse area. And I want to sort of explain how it relates to other areas and why this is important. So most of the substance, I'm going to follow Bob Cutter's book, Strategic Constitution, which is PDF online. I think I sent to Renita a link or a PDF. It's available online. You can just Google and get it. It's sort of an old book. It's now about 20 years, but it's still very much sort of looking at the different issues in constitutional law. The first thing we need to sort of make a distinction is that, I don't know in India, but in many countries in Europe, when you study constitutional law, there's something called the economic constitution. That is the rules of the constitution that apply to economics, economic relations, public finance, budget, and all those areas. And that's called usually the economic constitution. That's not what we're talking about. And that's clearly not what we're talking about because the American Constitution does not have an economic constitution. And therefore, that's a non-US concept. And that's why law and economics never really paid a lot of attention to what we call the economic constitution. What we mean by constitutional law and economics is essentially what a paper by Richard Posner, by Judge Posner in the mid 1980s called the Constitution as an economic document. I think it's probably Georgetown Law Journal, not completely sure, but it's a 1980 paper by Posner called the Constitution as an economic document. And what he wants to say is that you can also apply economic analysis, economic mindset to understand the Constitution, and in this case, of course, the American Constitution, which essentially means, first, the balance of power between the states and the federal government, and then, of course, the role of the three branches of government. And that's what we're talking about. So we're not talking about nationalization, privatization, budget, inflation, rules of money supply, and all of those things that people think that's the meaning of constitutional law and economics. There are some developments which are important. A very recent trendy area, it's called law and macroeconomics. I don't know if people have seen it. There's a sort of a growing field called law and macroeconomics. That field, sort of out of Yale and Georgetown, a few people are working on that field. That field really looks at the issues of budget and money supply, the central bank, so the Federal Reserve, sovereign bonds, and all those things that are relevant in macroeconomics and from a legal perspective. Now, that field is still sort of not very popular. It's not been popularized. A lot of people are quite critical because they say that's not really law and macroeconomics. That's just macroeconomics. There's nothing there that has to do with the law. It's purely macro policies. And so it's still sort of controversial, that field, but it's usually not included in law and economics. It's as a separate field by people who basically, some of them actually don't like law and economics and are well more focused on other lines of thinking. Now, if you look at, sort of the outline of Kutter's book, you can see also why constitutional law and economics is not really a very well-defined field of study, because it actually overlaps with many other areas. First, it overlaps with political science. A lot of what the book covers, and some of the things we're going to talk today, are very much overlapping with what political scientists do. Election systems, the consequences of coalition governments, how do the rules of the Constitution interfere with the organization of the parties, of the political parties, the leadership of the political parties. That's all a lot on political science side. Economists, in a way, have sort of invaded political science, but at the same time, as political science started using rational choice theory in the 1970s, it actually sort of made the role of economists very marginal. Because once the political scientists use the same model as the economists, there's actually no need for economists anymore, because the political scientists actually have the same model of thinking, the rational choice theory, and more institutional knowledge than the economists. Right? In fact, Coase, in one of his later books, wrote something on the same line, saying that the real problem is once the lawyers and but the lawyers mainly, once the lawyers understand rational choice theory, there's not going to be any jobs for economists, because the lawyers are better than the economists because they know rational choice theory and they know the institutional details. And the economists usually only know rational choice theory. They do not know the institutional details. So that's what happened a bit with political science. Political science, for a long time, as you know, was sort of political philosophy, political theory. They didn't have a sort of a model, a positive model. So in those days, economists had a role. But once the political scientists moved to what's called positive political theory, which is the rational choice theory, and then, of course, behavioral and all of those developments too, economists have basically withdrawn from these areas. And so a lot of the stuff that Bob Kutter covers in the book is actually now political science. It's not law and economics. Another area where this overlaps is public choice. Many of you have heard about public choice. And so public choice is essentially applying notions, you could say notions of the Coase theorem. People call it the political Coase theorem, or the Coase theorem applied to political bargaining, if you want to say. But essentially, public choice applies the ideas of the Coase theorem to the political process, right? And so public choice, as also overlaps a little bit with political economy, really is about two things that we're going to talk here. One is aggregation of preferences. That's really one of the major challenges is, okay, we have individual preferences. We all have individual preferences. Now, when it comes to goods and services, these individual preferences are aggregated by our demand and supply curves, right? I mean, we go to the market, we buy and sell goods and services, and as we do that, our different preferences are aggregated across the economy, across the country, then across the world in aggregated supply and demand curves. Now, for the political process, for political decisions, we don't really have the same mechanism, right? And so the question is, how are we going to aggregate our preferences in ways that are going to sort of produce the right outcome, right? And so there, as you're familiar, you bring in concepts like the arrow impossibility theorem that everyone learns in your economics 101. And remember, one of the challenges of the arrow impossibility theorem is to try to come up with rules of aggregation of preferences that are as democratic as possible and at the same time create stable outcomes. We do not want cycles where, unfortunately, as you know, a lot of times we do have those cycles. The reason, of course, is because we would like social preferences to have the same properties as individual preferences. Now, remember, the way our rational choice model works is through individual preferences being rational. And what you remember from your economics 101, what is the meaning of rational? That we have stable and complete preferences, that is complete and transitive preferences, right? Stable, complete, and transitive preferences. So we need the same for our societies, social preferences. So the question is, how do we go from individual preferences, individual rational preferences, to what we would like to be social rational preferences with the same properties? And of course, the problem is we don't really have a good answer to that. As you know, different election mechanisms have different problems. They create cycles. The way we aggregate preferences is always problematic. For example, people talk about the election market, the market for votes. Well, there's immediately a difference between the market for votes and a market for goods and services. When you go to your grocery shop, to a large extent, you can choose your bundle of goods, right? And to a large extent in your life, with some limitations, obviously, you can choose the bundle of goods and services you want to consume. Now, the problem with political process is that usually you cannot choose the bundle because you either vote for one party or you vote for a different party. Either you vote for one candidate or you vote for a different candidate. You cannot vote for one party in one specific issue, but for the other party on another specific issue. That is, in the political market, you have to buy bundles that are already designed by the politicians. You cannot yourself unbundle these goods. Whereas in most of the regular goods and services, you can actually unbundle and decide what you want, how many oranges, how many apples, how many strawberries you want. You do not have to buy a bundle of fruits that includes things you don't want. So that's a big difference. And so a lot of the literature is about aggregation mechanisms and how we address this bundling issue that politics involves. That gets into discussions of direct democracy versus representative democracy, because technically in direct democracy, you could actually do unbundling. You could have a referendum on every single policy. That would be an unbundle of the political process. Unfortunately, as we all know, that's dysfunctional and would be completely inappropriate to run a country if you have to subject every single policy to a referendum. So that's why we have representative democracy. It's easy to see there's a transaction cost problem. So representative democracy addresses these transaction costs. But of course, it creates another problem, which is the bundling issue, which we need to think about how to address. So one big issue is this aggregation of preferences. How do you go from individual to social preferences? And at that point, you start talking about, as you know, about the median voter, right? I mean, someone basically represents the median of the voters, and that's sort of the relevant voter from a strategic point of view. That's one concern. The other concern we have, which is the other big area of discussion, relates to the principal agent problem, right? And that's sort of more political economy rather than public choice. One thing I forgot on the public choice. Of course, part of the problem when you go from individual to social preferences, as you know, it's going to be what we call capture, right? The extent to which the aggregation mechanism, that is the political process, is captured by certain minorities to favor their interests over the interests of the community, right? And so that's sort of the capture theory of Mankian, Olson, and other public choice and public economists had in the past. So I want to move to the other issue, which is the political economy issue. The political economy issue, you also know it's a big area. It's the issue of agency costs. So here the problem is, obviously, even if we aggregate our preferences in a way that is appropriate, we still have a problem that the people who are going to be in government, and I don't mean just the prime minister and the ministers, or the state governors. I mean the bureaucrats, the judges, the prosecutors, everyone who works for the government on the behalf of the people. There's going to be a potential misalignment of preferences between these agents and the people, right? Notice how we basically have this in two steps. First, we go from individual preferences to social preferences. The social preferences are the preferences of the people. So let's assume we do know the preferences of the people, that, you know, whatever the people is, they have some social preferences which are complete, transitive, and stable. Let's assume that they're rational. The problem is they will have to delegate power to the politicians and the bureaucrats. And so the big issue is, would the politicians and the bureaucrats pursue the welfare of the people, or will they pursue their own goals at the expense of the welfare of the people? Now, the answer to this question depends on a lot of issues that need to be, considered. First, this is only a problem if the preferences are misaligned, right? I mean, if the politicians have the exact same preferences as the people, then of course there's no problem. Right.
Participants, please mute yourselves.
Thank you, Renit. So the first issue is, these preferences, if they're the same, there wouldn't be any problem. Unfortunately, we suspect they're not the same preferences. And let me emphasize here, this is not just about corruption. We're not just saying the politicians are all bad people, all corrupt, and they all want to make money, and they all want to steal money from the budget. That's, I mean, of course, there's that aspect, but that's sort of the most, extreme version of this. One possible problem, even if we all have the same preferences, but that immediately changes this, is we may have similar preferences, but we could have sort of different time horizons. The fact is, politicians are elected for jobs that usually have term limits. In a way, you have to be re-elected every 4 years, or in some cases, you cannot even do more than 1 or 2 terms. The same with bureaucrats. Bureaucrats, obviously, even if they have the same preferences, they also have a certain horizon, because your career is going to be 30 or 35 years. You're concerned about your retirement. You're concerned about what happens when you retire from a judge or from a prosecutor or from a police officer or from any ministry. So the fact that the people in a way live forever, but the agents have some clear time horizon, this may change priorities, right? So we may want to understand how the politicians and the bureaucrats will, for example, likely favor policies that have short-term benefits and long-term costs, because they get the benefits in the short term and they don't care about the costs in the long run, because they will not be in office or they will not be working for the government anymore. Now, the people cares about both, because although they get the benefits in the short run, they may also have to pay the costs in the long run. So one particular easy difference between the people and the representatives is the time discount rate. It's likely that people working in the government have a different time discount rate. They're more concerned about the present than the future, whereas individuals, the people, are equally concerned about the present and the future. You also have another issue, which is even if you think that democracy is the best way to get our representatives chosen, and even if you think these representatives, the politicians, reflect the preferences of the current generation, the problem is, in an election, future generations don't vote because they were not born yet, and so they do not vote. So it's likely that the preferences of the politicians reflect the current preferences of the voters, not the preferences of the people. Because when we think about the people, we have to include the future generations that have not yet been born, but of course should be part of our social preferences. And so that gets into discussions about how do we take into account the preferences of future generations if they're not representative in the current voting system, right? And then you get into the literature of independent regulatory agencies and the independent central bank and all these technocratic institutions that supposedly would be more independent from the government and from the current generation of politicians and the current generation of voters, and therefore more likely to reflect the social welfare preferences, that is, the preferences of the entire people, rather than the preferences of the current voters and the current politicians. Now, the second issue is, okay, even within the current generation of voters and politicians, of course, there is a problem of asymmetric information. Many of us, and in this group here, we are all sorts of educated, sophisticated citizens. But I'm sure many of you, as me, many times we don't understand what the government is doing. We cannot understand what the policies are, and why certain policies are being decided. A lot of that is asymmetric information. We do not have the same information as the politicians and as the government. In fact, we usually only have the information that the politicians tell us, because getting access to confidential documents, getting access to the real data is very hard. I don't know, I can speculate about India, but even in the US, which is supposed to be one of the most open and transparent bureaucracies in the world, getting access to data, getting access to documents is not that easy. Sometimes you have to go to court. If documents are classified as national security, you don't have access to them until 20, 30, 50 years after the policies were enacted. So of course, there's a very significant asymmetric information. Now, when we have asymmetric information, as economists, we know there's going to be two problems immediately. There is going to be a moral hazard problem, and it's going to be an adverse selection problem. The moral hazard problem is the politicians, the bureaucrats, are going to use the informational gap to their advantage, which means they may actually promote policies that are not good for the people, but are good for the politicians, and the people doesn't even know that these are bad policies, right? To a large extent, politics has a nature of a credence good. So if you remember from your microeconomics or your industrial organization, credence goods are those goods where the quality of the goods will not be known ever, or only in the very long term, and so very late for consumers to punish the producer. Right? That's the problem with credence goods, right? Credence goods are goods that the consumers cannot punish the low quality provider, because either they don't know it's low quality, or by the time they realize it's low quality, it's too late, right? And so the examples, as you know, it's your mechanics of your car, your dentist. I don't know if this happens to you in India, but every time I go to a dentist in the United States, there's a new problem. There's always a new problem. And it's like, I don't know if there's a new problem, but there's always a new problem. Every time you bring your car for an inspection, there's always a new problem with the car that you have to pay. And you don't know if this is true or if this is asymmetric information. I mean, unless you're an expert on cars or on being a dentist, you don't know. But to some extent, the same with a lawyer, right? I mean, lawyers have some credence good aspect to their services. You go to a lawyer, and the lawyer always tells you, oh, this is way more complicated than you think, right? And way more expensive, and this is going to be hell. You really are in big trouble. And you don't know, is this real, or am I just, being fooled? And so that's why with credence goods, you may need a second and a third visit to a different person to sort of have different views on this. And to a large extent, I mean, you can imagine a doctor, because I usually in my lectures, I give the doctors as another example. I mean, a doctor, if you get a bad doctor, by the time you realize you have a bad doctor, you might be dead. So there's very little thing you can do to punish your doctor, because you're just dead. And so these are credence goods. And credence goods means you need some form of regulation, some form of third-party intervention to make sure that the asymmetry of information is not used against consumers. So we have the exact same problem in the political process. In a way, as citizens, as members of the people, we consume political goods and services, but political goods and services are credence goods. We may not know they are very bad until 20, 30 years later. And so that's really a problem. So we need some forms of reducing the asymmetric information. That's why we need media. We need media, we need social media, we need journalists, we need experts, we need rating agencies, we need all sorts of institutions that try to minimize this problem. And you still have this real puzzles, right? I mean, we still have, you know, it's what I mean. The most historical puzzle, as you know, is always why did the Germans voted for Hitler in 1932? Were they just like crazy? How they voted for that stuff, right? The fact is they voted, so there's clearly asymmetric information. You know, because if you're going to, you know, die in the millions in a war, why do you vote for these people, right? So clearly there's a problem of asymmetric information. Now, true, there might be other problems. If you are a big fan of behavioral economics, you can do behavioral constitutional law and economics and start talking about all the cognitive biases and the framing effects and the optimism of the voters and all these different things that even if the information is there, people don't, you know, perceive the information the same way, right? That's sort of for sure. On side of moral hazard, we also have adverse selection, right? If you think there is asymmetric information, and the asymmetric information in the political process allows you to generate rents, of course, you may attract to become politicians people who want to make rents. That is the wrong kind of people, right? If the political process is rigged and very corrupt, we are going to attract more corrupted politicians. And so this is part of the problem. If we do not have the right institutions to address this, we end up with the wrong kind of people serving as politicians or as bureaucrats. And we have many examples of this, right? Of course, corruption is one problem, but it's not even probably the most concerning problem. For example, one big issue with the bureaucracy, with bureaucrats, it's the extent to which we attract people who are very risk averse. If people who are more risk lovers prefer to become lawyers and you know and have a private sector life, and the people who become judges are more risk averse people, this is going to be an issue, because that means the judges are not going to reflect sort of the median risk preferences in our society. If you think that people who want to work for the government are just lazier people because they want a fixed salary, they want tenure, they don't want risks, and so you attract people who are more inclined to be lazy, we're going to have a serious shirking problem. And so it could be that the way we structure the incentives attracts people that might not be the people you want managing your government or managing your bureaucracies. So there's a potential adverse selection problem that we also care about, is the extent to which the people who are going to be elected politicians, the people who are going to work for the bureaucracy, the people who are going to be judges, are people who reflect social preferences as a whole, or if they're a self-selected group that has some specific preferences. Now, of course, there are many ways we can discuss how to fix this and the extent to which we have mechanisms to try to fix this, but we need to be extremely careful about this principal agent problem. That is, that we are likely to have moral hazard and we are likely to have adverse selection. And it's very obvious to all of us right now, particular in the era of social media and a lot of TV exposure and a lot of the way we do politics in the 21st century, not just in the United States, it's the same in India, it's the same all over the world. I think even in autocratic countries like China or Russia, that, for example, you're now having more and more politicians who clearly are narcissists. This is not just a coincidence. This is adverse selection, because the way we vote, the way we organize our political system in the 21st century, the way we use social media, the way we use TV and radio, the way we use and select people, of course, ends up attracting narcissists who actually feel good about themselves and actually have a significant cognitive dissonance problem, right? I mean, that's clearly the case in the United States. I mean, you know, Donald Trump is a good example of a mega narcissist, but you have the same problem in Russia right now. So, and these are people who, of course, when making decisions, they will not do the cost benefit analysis that they should do, because the way they assign probabilities, the way they understand the costs and the benefits is quite different from the regular people or people who are not suffering from the same bias. So this is a very important issue that we have to care about. So essentially, these are sort of the two big topics for constitutional law and economics, is the aggregation of preferences, and the other one is the political economy, delegation, moral hazard, and reverse selection. There's a third aspect I want to talk about a little bit in this introduction, which is the issue of constitutional rights. So if you look at Bob Cooter's book, the last part of the book is essentially about what he calls rights, right? And how to think about rights. Now, I think there are one or two things, and so I'm not going to go too much into that part of the book, so I just want to say a few things in case people want to read that part of the book and have some interest in that part of the book. From a conceptual point of view, of course, it's sort of tautological and trivial for an economist to say there is an optimal amount of rights. What is the optimal amount of rights? It's when the marginal benefit of those rights equals the marginal cost. Rights have benefits to the citizens, to the population, all of us, but they also have costs because we need money to implement those rights. When we say people have a First Amendment right to freedom of speech, as you know, this is a big thing in the United States. Well, there's a benefit because you have freedom of speech. You can say what you want, when you want, but there's a cost, which is you're going to potentially offend other people. You're going to potentially use language that other people find it appalling. You may say things that will not be pleasant to everyone. So there's a benefit, there's a cost. Where should we find efficiency? When marginal benefit equals marginal cost. That's sort of trivial, tautological. What does this mean in practical terms? Well, in practical terms, it introduces into the discussion of constitutional rights, like as I already mentioned yesterday, the concept of trade-offs. And the concept of trade-offs obviously is in contradiction with constitutional theories of absolute rights, right? So as you know, in constitutional law, many theories argue for absolute rights. The usual example is human rights. We should have absolute human rights. Well, if you have absolute rights, you then have a problem in terms of what happens when one absolute right.
Navya, can you stop talking, please?
Into the problem of contradiction with other rights, right? When you have a contradiction between absolute rights, how do you solve this problem? You have the absolute right to freedom of speech, but you also have the absolute right to defend your honor and your name. Well, in many cases, of course.
Parv, sorry, sir. Parv, are you in the course? Are you in the session? Sorry, Professor, please continue.
No. If I think the management comes first. So can I continue?
Parv, can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am.
Are you attending the session?
Yes, ma'am.
Then can you stop doing what you're doing just now?
Okay, ma'am. Sorry.
Sorry, Professor, please continue.
So we're talking about contradiction of absolute rights. If you have a contradiction of absolute rights, you need a way to think about how to address this. And what law and economics would suggest is the way you would address this is by identifying the trade-off, right? So I don't know, one of you can explain me later how it works in India, but as you may know, in the United States, the general idea is that when you are a public figure, the freedom of speech trumps your right to a good name and your honor, which means that politicians and public figures cannot really sue for defamation unless they can show malicious intent, which of course is a very high burden and not easy to prove. On the other hand, if you're a private person can sue for defamation with a lower burden of proof, with a lower standard of proof, I'm sorry, because we would say that for a private person, the right to your good name and honor might at some point be more relevant than the freedom of speech of the other side. So there's what we call the New York Times versus Sullivan standard, that politicians and public figures have a different standard than private. Now, of course, I don't know if this has been an issue in India too. This has become a big problem with social media, because what is a private person in social media? Are we all public figures now? Because if we have a Twitter account or Instagram or Facebook, we are all now public figures, and therefore are we all subject to the Sullivan standard? It's unclear. So the courts in the US have sort of complicated this, which is great for lawyers, by creating what they call the quasi-public figure. And the quasi-public figure means you're not really in government, you're not really an actor, you're not really famous, but at the same time you have a lot of followers on Instagram or a lot of followers on Twitter. And once you have a lot of followers on Twitter, on Instagram, you are no longer a private person. So you're subject to other people saying bad things about you, and you cannot really sue for defamation. So this is a big example on how to balance absolute rights, and how I think law and economics is useful, because it actually gives you a way to understand this balance of rights. Of course, there are more complicated questions, right? I mean, one thing economists tried in the 1980s, and then I think we stopped because we were really getting in trouble, is trying to address abortion from a law and economics perspective. Because abortion, the problem is you have two rights in confrontation again. The right of the woman to her body and her decisions, and the right of the baby to be born. And the question is, how do we actually address these two rights? There's no way we can really say they should coexist at the same time, because of course, if they coexist at the same time, we have a problem. So we can say, of course, the right of the woman, of the mother, prevails over the right of the baby, and that means we have an abortion law that regulates these rights. Or we can take the other position and say the right of the baby overlaps, prevails, trumps the right of the mother, and we prohibit abortion in our jurisdiction. But we have to make a choice here. Now, the problem when you bring law and economics here is that, of course, at a very abstract level, the answer is easy. We should have the marginal benefit equaling the marginal cost, sure, tautological, trivial. So at a very abstract level, it's easy to say these things, but what does it mean in the context of abortion? And of course, it becomes a big issue because most societies, we do not even have an agreement on the costs and benefits of these rights. So, people who are pro-life are going to argue that the cost of the baby not being born is just very high. Whereas the pro-abortion side will actually argue that the cost for the woman of not being able to make her decision is very high. So we have no agreement over the costs. And if we have no agreement over the costs, obviously, it's going to be very hard to come up with a policy that really is efficient and really responds to both sides. Posner, just a side note, wrote a very, very controversial paper, which actually killed his chances to be nominated to the Supreme Court, because the Christian right was very upset about this paper. He wrote this paper in the late 1980s, sorry. And his argument, as economists, you can understand. So his argument, this is a problem of incomplete markets, right? So I'll go over his argument and then try to argue why this is so problematic. His argument is, if we had a complete market for babies, this would not be an issue. Because what would happen is every baby would be born, and then the highest bidder would get the baby. Now, for most babies, the highest bidder would be the parents. And so they would bid for their own baby and they would take the baby home. And for those babies that the mother and the father don't want the baby, there would be some other bidder that through adoption would actually get the baby. And so his argument is the discussion about abortion is just wrong. It's not a problem of costs and benefits. It's a problem of incomplete markets. Now, here's the problem. So you can read the paper. It's a very fun paper to read now, 40 years later. But you can see where the argument has some economic flaws. The first flaw in this argument is you're assuming that if we have a market for babies, so you can imagine, let's imagine a country where every time you have a baby, you give the baby to some sort of a bank, let's call this baby bank, and then the baby bank would auction the baby. And if you love your baby, you would basically bid for this baby and get the baby. But if you don't want your baby, somebody else would get the baby, right? And so in this world, there's no abortion because all babies are born and they're all assigned to the highest bidder. Remember, this is really efficiency because you're getting the person who gives the highest value on the baby to get the baby. So that's really the concept of efficiency. The asset is being allocated to the highest bidder. Now let's see why with babies this would be a huge problem. And I think Posner did not realize. First, transaction costs. Obviously, this is going to be a huge issue in terms of how the bids are going to be done. And of course, many people may have judgment-proof restrictions. People may not have money. So how can we bid on this if there's no money? Now, Posner comes in and says, oh, there's a solution to that. We would create a financial institution that would basically operate on the base of loans and savings to make money available for the parents bidding. But that, of course, creates another layer of transaction costs because now we're going to have some financial institution. How is this going to be run? Who is going to own this financial institution? And how do you know where you're going to get the money allocated? So first problem, transaction costs. So a Gaussian bargaining here, it's starting to be a problem because you have transaction costs. The second problem is, of course, asymmetric information. Now, even if you imagine that this baby bank would be very, very nice and extremely effective and disclose all the information about the baby, the fact is you will have significant asymmetric information. You don't know when a baby is born all the information about that baby. You don't even know the future of the baby. And as you know, this is an issue with adoption, for example, right? I mean, adoption laws around the world are problematic because this is asymmetric information. You don't know the quality of parenting. You don't know the quality of the parents. So to a large extent, there would be extremely difficult matching of supply and demand in this market because we have a lot of asymmetric information between demand and supply. And so probably we would have moral hazard, we would have adverse selection, we would have all the issues that asymmetric information has. So you can see how a sort of a smart, elegant, law and economic solution to the problem of abortion becomes, in fact, a very controversial and, in fact, very, limited solution to the problem, because I think Posner was not taking into account fully the economic problems of creating that issue. Yes, we can see why incomplete markets is an issue. We know that's an externality. We know that from economics, that it's a market failure when we have incomplete markets. So we can see that in the area of family law being an issue, we have incomplete markets, but that does not mean that the solution would be to create that market artificially, because sort of Gaussian solution, right? Remember, the Gaussian solution is always to create markets, right? Remember, Gauss telling us is when you have an externality, how do you address the externality? You create a market for that externality, right? You assign property rights, you assign bargaining rights, and by doing that, you create a market. Boom, problem solved, great. Well, it doesn't always work because, as Gauss himself writes in this 1960 article, there is the issue of transaction costs. When you have high transaction costs, this is not going to work. When you have strategic interactions like asymmetric information, this is not going to work, right? When you have badly defined property rights, this is not going to work. And so we have many areas where this sort of the Gaussian solution is not going to work. It seems to me that in the case of abortion, it's not going to work because you have many issues with transaction costs, with asymmetric information, and even with incomplete property rights, because the problem is the baby is yet to be born. And so you cannot really assign property rights to an entity that has yet to exist. All right, so that's a problem of applying the Gauss theorem here. There are more examples, and if you go through the book goes over several examples of rights and how the rights may be in contradiction, which creates a challenge to this notion of absolute rights, and how law and economics can be useful identifying the trade-offs. Let me give you another example on how this becomes a slippery slope that is also problematic. This is another paper on Posner on torture. So let's say we have the absolute right not to be tortured. That's a human right. Most constitutional systems prohibit torture in criminal procedure and so on. Now, let's think of the following situation. There's a terrorist, and we know for sure that this terrorist has an information where a bomb is placed. And if we can get that information from the terrorist, we are going to save 100 million people. But if we do not extract that information, then 100 million people are going to die. So the question is, should this be an absolute right? The choice is, we do not torture this person, and therefore 100 million people die, or we torture this person and we get information that saves 100 million people. Now you understand how the example works, because we are saying everything is with probability 1. We're saying if we torture, we know with probability 1 that we'll get the information that saves these people. We know if we don't get this information, there's no way we can save these people. And finally, we know with probability 1 that this guy has the information. So obviously, if you think as an absolute rights person, a person who defends absolute rights, your answer should be, yes, we cannot torture this person, and even if 100 million people die, we cannot torture this person, because torture is not acceptable. It's an absolute right not to be subject to torture. Now, of course, what you're saying is your absolute right is killing 100 million people, and you think that's the right price to pay for this absolute right. So what Posner argues is that any person more moderate and more pragmatic would say, well, for a cost of 100 million lives, I will be willing to torture this person, get the information, because I save 100 million lives, I may harm one person. So 100 million against one person, definitely we should focus on the 100 million, not the one person. Now, where is the trick here? The trick is, if you accept the pragmatic reasoning, then you're saying there's an extreme hypothetical, this one, very extreme hypothetical, where I'm saying this right is not absolute. Well, if that's sort of the law and economics answer, which is, of course, the right law and economics answer to this problem, then the question is, where do we put the threshold, right? Because in the extreme example, you have that people know that torture with probability 1 is going to save 100 million people, that this terrorist with probability 1 has the information, and so on. But of course, in reality, we don't have probability 1s. It's all probabilistic. So when do we put the threshold? Do we say when the probability is 80%? When the probability is 60%? When the probability is 30%? And we don't know, right? But that is when law and economics comes in. Again, as I've been saying, from an abstract point of view, the answer is easy. We should have the threshold where the marginal benefit equals the marginal cost. But that's just, tautological again. We know in economics, that's always the answer. But in the specific case of torture, where should we say the marginal cost equals the marginal benefit? Because we can say, well, harming one person to save 100 million people with probability 1, the marginal benefit really outweighs the marginal cost, so we should do it. But let's say it's with probability 50%. Let's say it's with probability 20%. Is the marginal benefit now outweighing the marginal cost? I don't really have an answer to that question. And so things become sort of problematic, because if you say, how about we torture someone to save 100 million people with probability 10%? Is this reasonable? Is this a situation where the marginal benefit outweighs the marginal cost? Well, it becomes problematic. So, yes, but then if you argue, Sarah, that you should have an absolute right, you always get in trouble with extreme cases. The problem is really how you go around that. Of course, I agree with you that no case in national security will be an extreme case. Obviously, it's always a percentage case. You always work with percentages and probabilities. But the problem is, there's a point at which the absolute right argument becomes sort of inconsistent with a marginal benefit, marginal cost analysis, and that's a problem. Of course, also there's an issue that you're sort of hindering there, which is also problematic. It goes back to the point I was making earlier, is that the person who is going to be implementing this policy might have different goals than the whole society. So we can imagine if we delegate to the police the decision to torture, right? If we say this is not an absolute right, under certain circumstances, the police could use torture to extract the evidence, we're going to create a principal agent problem, because the police is going to use asymmetric information to actually practice torture more often than they should, because we don't know when these thresholds are actually being met or not. So yes, the asymmetric information does bring this other problem of delegation. This is also why courts procedure become a problem in national security, right? I mean, yes, a lot of these things have to be subject to national security courts, but of course, national security courts are secret. They're not open to the public. We don't know what sort of arguments are being made. So again, you have to delegate to these specialized judges the decisions when in fact, again, you could suspect that there are serious capture problems, that at some point, these judges might just be captured by the agenda of the national security agencies. So there are many arguments here we can make. No one could check. Of course, I mean, I'm just making hypotheticals to show that an absolute right argument needs to answer to situations where it's obvious that the marginal benefit outweighs the marginal cost. I mean, definitely, most probably the thresholds were not met in many of the things that happened in the Guantanamo, and the way what was the word Americans used, the rendering operations during the Iraq War. But that's, you know, getting into the nitty-gritty details. However, again, I don't want to get into national security law. This is not our seminar today. I just want to emphasize why the law and economics approach might be quite different from the absolute rights approach. Notice also that for the same reasoning, we might provide different arguments for human rights, right? People in law and economics don't do a lot of work in human rights. But of course, if you want to have an economic argument for human rights, it has to be, as usual, a consequential argument, a consequentialist argument. It has to be that you believe human rights actually are good for efficiency. And obviously, one argument, very easy argument to make, is that human rights have a positive externality effect, and they actually help economic growth and economic development. And so that would be an argument for human rights. We don't need to get into discussions about social justice and other non-economic arguments. We can easily provide economic arguments for why human rights make sense. Okay, before I sort of break here with this introduction, I do want to go back to this sort of general view of the topics, because one particular aspect that is important in this discussion is in many areas of law and economics, when you do criminal law and economics, torts law and economics, contract, or civil procedure, we tend to treat the courts and the judges as a sort of black box, right? We have these efficient rules. So if you remember from torts, you spend time discussing if strict liability is more or less efficient than negligence. In contracts, we keep talking about the efficiency of breach of contract. In criminal law, we were talking about efficient punishment, efficient probability, efficient sanction. And then in property law, we're always talking about efficient adverse possession, efficient rules of property, efficient property rules, efficient liability rules. That's all we do in law and economics. But of course, one problem with all this discussion is we assume that somehow, by some form of miracle, the judges, the courts will enforce these efficient rules, right? And so one big question we have is, why would a judge do that, right? That gets us here, because when we start looking at constitutional law and economics, we have to talk about judges, the judicial power. Where are these people coming from? Who appoints them? Who recruits them? Who selects them? And why would these people be efficient? Why would these people care about efficiency? In fact, why would these people care about law and economics at all, right? Yes, we know some judges care about law and economics. Judge Posner, Judge Easterbrook, Judge Kaczynski in the Ninth Circuit. But why would judges care about law and economics? Right? And so there we have this sort of literature that Posner introduced called the efficiency hypothesis of the common law. His argument would be that the common law evolves to become efficient. And the reason is, according to Posner, of course, that less efficient laws are more litigated than efficient laws. And since less efficient laws are more litigated, they are more subject to court intervention. And the courts would push these laws to efficiency. So in the long run, the principles of the common law would be the efficient principles that survived litigation through, decades and centuries of litigation. Now, this is a very interesting argument. And so sort of the general principles of the common law, the basic principles of our Constitution would be efficient because they come from a process of litigation through the centuries of inefficient laws. Now, one issue with the argument, as you can imagine, is, but why would courts move laws to become efficient? And obviously, what Posner writes in his book, because this was in his 1972 book, is that somehow is an argument similar to Adam Smith's invisible hand. His idea is that the judges would be some sort of invisible hand that would push laws to efficiency just for the reason that they would consider costs and benefits. Now, this is a highly controversial argument because I don't think there's any reason to think that judges care about costs and benefits, first of all. Many judges, in fact, don't care about costs and benefits, and they make decisions based on legal principles that actually might be completely alien to costs and benefits. But there's also two other issues. One is ideology. That is, judges have an ideology, whatever ideology is, but they have some ideology. Ideology matters to the calculations of costs and benefits. It is possible that for the same actions, the costs and benefits are calculated in different ways depending if you're more progressive or more conservative. And that's okay in economics. That's not a problem for economics. Because what do? People do different cost and benefit analysis, and then we aggregate through aggregated demand and aggregated supply. So for economics, this is not a problem. Unfortunately, for institutions, this is a problem. Because if we have judges with different preferences, with different ideologies, making cost-benefit analysis differently, it's unclear how this aggregates in terms of precedent. It's unclear how this aggregates in terms of social preferences. So first problem is the same cases may have different outcomes depending on how these supposedly efficient judges do their cost-benefit analysis. Of course, the second problem is this would work potentially, if we had universal access to courts. But the problem is we don't have universal access to courts. And access to courts is not a function of the inefficiency of the underlying law being litigated, as Posner is suggesting, but it's a function of wealth and assets. So it could be that very inefficient laws are never litigated because poor people do not have the resources to litigate them. And therefore, inefficient laws that, for example, protect the interests of the wealthy but harm the interests of the poor are not going to be litigated, and they're going to prevail in the common law because the damaged party does not have the resources to litigate them. So the litigation mechanism is problematic because it's a biased mechanism. It is not of universal access, so that every law has the same chance of being litigated independently of wealth, independently of plaintiffs and defendants. And of course, the other problem with this argument that the judicial power will make laws more efficient and that the common law in the long run is efficient is that we have new laws all the time because our society is changing, because technology is changing. So what is the long run in this respect, right? If you think in terms of the core areas of the common law, let's take property law, principles of property law. Well, the notion of property and the way we provide economic value of property now, it's not the same as in the 15th or the 16th or the 17th century. So it is likely that the principles of property law in the 17th century that were efficient are not necessarily efficient in the 21st century. And we have good examples of that. Most common law countries are not using the general principles of fair trade as we had them in the 16th and 17th century in the common law, but is actually doing antitrust law. That is a much more recent development of the law. Well, if you take Posner's argument, then we would be concluding that we already had efficient principles, the so-called fair trade, the general principles of fair trade in the common law. So how do we actually got to be using antitrust law? How do we actually decided at some point to replace the entire principles of the common law by a new law, by a new statute, when in fact, if the courts are doing their job, which is to improve efficiency, we would expect to have an efficient law, by the end of the 19th century. Of course, the reasons why we change is because the fair trade principles were not adequate to deal with big corporations, big cartels, and all the development of the financial markets and corporate markets. So bottom line, I do think that this idea that Posner has, that the law in the long run is efficient, in particular constitutional law and the basic principles of the common law are efficient in the long run because the courts and the judges will promote efficiency, is really problematic, and it's not really convincing when you think of the whole context of development of constitutional norms and the general principles of the common law. Okay, I think this is time for our break, as usual, around this time. Let me suggest we do a break now. We'll come back at, what is it, 7:30 in India? Something like that. We'll open for questions. And then depending on the questions, I'll move a little bit more into the specifics of Kuter's book. Is that okay? So should we be back in about 10 minutes?
Perfect.
Okay. So I'll see you all in 10 minutes.
Yes, Professor. Thank you.
Space lock carry.
Okay, I guess we're back.
There's some questions in the chat box.
Yes, I've seen there's a question on the anchoring bias. Now, I think this is more complicated. Well, yes, I mean, I agree with suggestion, but I think things get more complicated. I have a paper with Giuseppe De Macciati in the Supreme Court Economic Review, where we try to explain some of the problems. If you, and in fact, the paper is a critique to Kaplow and Chevelle and their argument on welfare. Here's the problem. If you say that collective preferences are an aggregation of individual preferences, but then your individual preferences also are affected by collective preferences, which is a possibility, then of course you may end up with an infinite regress that's not going to be easy. I mean, mathematically this is very easy to show, but intuitively what we're saying is my individual preferences depend on the collective preferences, but the collective preferences depend on my individual preferences. And so this is going to create a cycle which is going to be highly problematic for policy because it means my preferences should influence policy, but the policy also influences my preferences, which means that in that setting, you may not have actually an efficient policy because you may create, a cycle where you change the policy, you change my preferences. Because you change my preferences, then you need to change the policy. Then you change the policy, you change my preferences, and so you are always in this cycle. And so it becomes really difficult to see what would be an efficient outcome there. So it would be sort of the cost-benefit analysis there would be extremely problematic because, as you're saying in your example with the anchoring biases, it would be a situation like that. Your estimation of costs and benefits is incorrect, and it's basically just self-fulfilling or self-reflecting the bias itself, which becomes a problem. So I don't have an answer to that question. If that's true, if we actually have people who have preferences reflecting anchoring biases based on collective decisions, on collective preferences, this becomes a very hard problem to see how it should be addressed. Sorry, I don't have a magic solution to this problem, but I think it's a very serious problem. But again, this is related to some of the questions. I think economists, we don't have a good answer, but political scientists and psychologists are trying to make up is why is that in so many countries we are polarizing our political preferences, right? I mean, why is this polarization taking place? Is it because we have individually polarized and therefore in aggregation we are polarized? Or a bit like the example you're using, is it that because I see other people polarizing and my beliefs are anchored in what I see other people doing, and therefore my response is to polarize because other people are polarizing, right? And so if that's what's going on, then you have, self-fulfilling prophecy that we all polarize because we think everybody else is polarizing, and what I see is other people polarizing. So it's a bit of an issue. I mean, the alternative theory, as you know, for polarization, which I'm not a big believer, but it's a possible theory, it's the social media. The idea that the problem is there is more asymmetric information now than before, because in social media, I only follow people who say the things I say, and so it polarizes me because I don't have access to the information on the other side. I'm not a big believer of that theory because I think you, if you want, on Twitter or on Instagram, wherever you are, you can see whatever you want. You don't have to see only people who agree with you. So, you know, I think there's some limitations to that theory. Okay, let me see. How relevant the economics of delayed response to crisis in general? Yes, but the problem, I mean, I think the explanation is the explanation. The puzzle is, why aren't governments, authorities, bureaucrats able to maximize economic opportunities, right? I mean, why is that this delay? And, you know, there could be two different explanations. One is an information problem, right? I mean, there's a delay because it takes time for people to realize that there are these opportunities. Well, that's an asymmetric information explanation. And so if that's a problem, then we need to fix that. We need to fix that delay in information. Why is the government taking more time than they should gathering information? Why are, you know, regulators or the bureaucracies procedures not as quick as they should be? That's one line of argument. There's a different line of argument, which is the reason why we're missing opportunities is because the authorities are really taking care of them and not taking care of the country or of the people. That is, the authorities are not missing their opportunities. I mean, they're missing the opportunities for the country, but they're not missing their opportunities. So in that case, it's a principal agent problem. And that goes to the conversation we had before, which is how the structure of the government, of the bureaucracy, incentivizes politicians or bureaucrats to take the right decisions. Keep in mind a few things. Democracy, for example, only works when bad politicians are punished by the voters, right? When voters do not punish bad politicians, then there's no principal agent solution to this. And I think that leads us to, for example, discussions about how come people vote for corrupt politicians and how come corrupt politicians get reelected in some countries, right? And at some point, of course, you have to come up with some argument like economists have made of systemic corruption, where the problem is everyone is corrupt, and that's why you vote for corrupt politicians. But that's like the failure of the principal agent model. It's the failure of democracy. Democracy presupposes that if people do not maximize opportunities, they get fired by the next election and are replaced by people who are better at taking economic opportunities. If that's failing, if that's not what's happening, then we have a serious principal agent problem, because that means the agent is not being punished by the principal. Of course, there are reasons for that. One of them, of course, as I mentioned, could be that some policies are credence goods. People do not understand the negative side of their policies until very later. The other is pure asymmetric information. We don't know what the politicians are doing. I think every country, and I'm sure India is not an exception, where when the economy is booming, that's the government's policies. When the economy is going down, it's the international crisis. It's the other countries. It's not about the government. Everywhere this happens. When we have good news, it's our government. When we have bad news, it's somebody else that should be blamed. Now, we don't have, many times we don't have information to say, well, this sounds fishy, but do we really know? Do we really know the extent to which this is bad policies, bad domestic policies, or just a consequence of international policies? I mean, you know, and if we are the educated voters, and we don't know, can you imagine that uneducated people, the people who have no idea what's going on out there, and they're being told this is the way it goes. So it's very problematic the way this works. And so I think if it's a question of delay because of information, then there's an issue of information that we need to sort out. If it's because there's a failure of principal agent, then I think we need to think about how democracy works. Keep in mind something I didn't say, where law and economics also overlaps with development economics, is we would all, yeah, I mean, of course, there could be a problem of unbundling. Of course, you don't know many times in the policies what are the wrong elements and the right elements. It's like, apart from the experts, does anyone understand the budget, the national budget? I mean, does anyone understand? I mean, when they ask you questions in surveys, are you for or against the budget? What is the meaning of that question? I mean, I don't understand the budget. I mean, I'm in favor or against. I don't know what you're asking. So it's always like, you know, does anyone think that lives in the country with low taxes? I think everyone complains we have high taxes. I mean, does anyone think that we should pay more taxes? I don't think so. Anyone will say, no, we should not pay more taxes. So what does it mean? Do you like the taxes you pay? No, I don't like the taxes I pay, of course. I mean, you know, everyone would like to live in a world where we get provision of public goods and we don't pay taxes. This would be ideal. Somebody else is paying for this. That's a great world. Unfortunately, that's not going to be very operational. So I think there is, of course, an issue of unbundling. Yes, I mean, I think the issue of corruption is, but even the issue of corruption is problematic, because what do we call corruption, right? A lot, I mean, of course, it's financial corruption, wealth corruption, that's sort of obvious. Someone who stole $1 billion, of course, we understand that's corruption. But then there's a lot of cronyism, right? I mean, which is not really corruption. And a lot of our democracies, unfortunately, are operating with a lot of cronyism. And cronyism is a problem because it basically means inefficient allocation of talent. That is, you're choosing the wrong people for the wrong jobs, and there's a complete waste of talent. And waste of talent means we're not growing the economy as much as we could because we are wasting talent. So that's, I think, a way more problematic issue with our current democratic systems. It's the complete waste of talent because of cronyism on many political and bureaucracy choices. There's one point, however, I wanted to emphasize, which I didn't mention, which, as I said, we overlap with development economics, is the extent to which democracy fosters economic growth, right? And of course, we would all like to say that democracy fosters economic growth, because then the argument to persuade people that we need democracy and we should have democracy is that at some point we're all going to be wealthier and there's going to be more wealth to everyone, and that's why democratic society is way better. Unfortunately, as you know, the empirical regressions are complicated for all sorts of questions. And the usual elephant in the room is, of course, China, right? I mean, China has the fastest growth rates in the last 30 years, and it's not democratic. In fact, if anything, it's becoming less democratic. And even if you look at, you know, the BRICS, right? The 4 fastest growing economies, Brazil, Russia, India, and China. Well, 2 of them are not democratic, Russia and China. And of course, that means if 2 of them are not democratic, you can't say democracy is what is promoting these fastest growing economies. So it's a really problematic. I mean, I know the smart papers by Asimoglu trying to estimate differences in differences and trying to control for other variables to show that at the margin you have fast growing economic rates, but It's always problematic. I mean, even if you look at my native country, Portugal, the fastest growing rates were during the dictatorship, not during the democratic regime. Again, you can argue that's a levels problem. It's because during the dictatorship, the level of GDP per capita was so low that you could easily have 6-8% growth rates. And by the time you get to some middle GDP per capita, you get in what's called the middle income trap, and you can't really grow at the same rates. And so it's a levels problem. Sure, you can make that argument. But still, the fact is that the highest growth rates were not achieved under democracy, were achieved under dictatorship. This also applies to Chile, as you know. The Pinochet years and the Pinochet economic programs were the ones that produced the fastest and high growth rates in all Latin America. And Chile has not been able to get those growth rates again under democracy. So the relationship between democracy and economic growth, economic development, wealth accumulation are way more problematic and way less linear than we would like to expect. The same goes to the sort of Posnerian argument, which, as you know, Schleifer and other economists have taken to the World Bank, that the common law countries have fastest growth rates than civil law countries because the common law is better for business. Now, first of all, there's a discussion about that, if the common law is really better for business than the civil law, but that's a sort of a separate discussion. As to economic growth rates, if you look at the data, this is true after the 1940s, 1945 to 2008. This is not true since 2008. In fact, the result is reversed. If you add the last 15 years, the civil law jurisdictions have been growing faster than the common law jurisdictions, which would be a problem for the theory, because you can't explain why it changed after the financial meltdown if in fact it's the common law and not some other issue. And the other problem is, if you look at growth rates, the common law countries that have been having high growth rates are countries like India and many of the former British colonies in Africa, like South Africa. It is not the United States, it is not the UK as compared to Germany or France. So it would seem, if the common law has any effect, it seems to have an effect on developing economies, does not seem to have any significant effect on developed economies, something the theory by Posner cannot really explain. And why would the common law be better in developing economies, but when you go to the UK or US or Canada and compare to Germany or France, you don't find the same results. So unfortunately, we all would like to have good explanations for what's going on here, but not really. Yes, I mean, there's a question here. We have to, different economic models by different economies. Right, but the problem there is you need to be careful about this argument, because you want to understand the context and the local determinants, right? So I totally agree with you. And my writings in this area have always been, I do not like the one size fits all sort of mentality of the World Bank, that every country has to follow the same policies because the same policies work in all countries. I definitely do not like that sort of approach by the World Bank, and I think it's wrong. And I do agree, we do need to look at different economic models depending on the different contexts, the different economies. But as economists, we cannot make the mistake of going to the opposite side and start arguing that every single country, every single economy is different, and therefore there are no general lessons. Because that's the mistake, the opposite mistake, is to say, well, India is so different from everyone else that we cannot learn from other countries, and no other country can learn from India, because we are so distinct, right? I mean, if you make a regression and you say everything is about the fixed effects, country fixed effects, then you're not really bringing any sort of useful explanation, because you're saying everything is about the country fixed effect. Everything is about the specific country. So it is problematic to move too far in the opposite direction. I do think the one-size-fits-all approach is wrong. It's problematic, but I don't think we can make the opposite mistake of saying everything is individually different and we cannot make any sort of inference. Yes, but really, I mean, yes, I understand the question by Suha, but that's another discussion. I mean, really, the extent to which economic growth means the same thing as human development. And of course, China is really behind in human development. And so that's another discussion. I do want to say something, which was sort of common conversation of economists 20 years ago, that as China was growing so fast, it was inevitable that they would create a middle class of consumers who would basically at some point threaten the regime, and China would evolve to democracy, because it's not possible to have economic growth an authoritarian state for a long time. Clearly, that has not happened in the last 25 years. So it does seem that China now is sort of a puzzle, because it does seem to provide an example of a country where we have a sophisticated middle class, we have a very demanding consumer class that wants to buy all sorts of goods and services, but at the same time, it coexists with a very authoritarian system where these consumers cannot participate in the market for political and public policies, because it's quite different. Well, yeah, I mean, I'm not going to get if it's crony capitalism or if it's perfect capitalism. The issue is the traditional approach that the development of a consumer middle class market economy is not consistent with authoritarian states. It has to be reviewed, at least at this point. Things may change. Of course, people are now talking about competitive authoritarianism and other sort of loose concepts to try to say that the reason why Chinese authoritarianism has survived is because somehow it's competitive, whatever competitive means in this context. We'll see. I mean, I'm just saying that this old idea that economic growth leads to democracy does not seem to be taking place in the world right now. More questions? Yes, I see Suha has raised hand. Yes, go ahead.
Right, sir. So, you had talked about the principal agent issue, wherein there's raging corruption with, politicians and bureaucrats putting their own individual preferences over, what do I say, the goals of the people, because of which there is an inefficient reallocation of resources, which may have some short-term benefits, but in the long term is really going to have some huge costs. But in states like Tamil Nadu and Kerala, which have rampant corruption and one of the most corrupted states probably in India, they have the system of, there's a huge, what do I say, the party in power always changes every 5 years. The anti-incumbency is always high around the time of elections. So in cases like that, how is there an actual economic development when there's rampant corruption and each party doing their business and then rubbing their hands off and leaving it to the next ruling party?
So that's Well, there's several issues to that. I mean, one of the problems is when the democratic mechanisms do not work to stop corruption, right? And of course, one of the big puzzles of democracy, one of the big problems of democracy is you can do redistribution to buy your own votes, right? So I don't think this is a problem in India, because India is a country where you still have a growing population. But you can see this in Europe. This is a real problem in Europe right now. You have a diminishing population, right? So here's the problem. What you start observing is governments tailoring policies to the old people at the expense of the young people. But the old people are the majority because the new generations are smaller and smaller. And this is not corruption. This is just a problem with democracy. It's like saying, I'm going to protect the interests of the older people. The younger people have to pay taxes to finance these policies. And this is democratic because the majority is old. So I think this gets into what we call in the literature the failures of government, right? I mean, there are situations where democracy really fails to achieve efficient policies because of the way democracy operates. Now, with the corruption, I think we need to understand what we mean by corruption. Right? I mean, what we mean by corruption is we're doing redistribution through mechanisms that are not transparent, right? And what this means is you create a misallocation of talent. Right? So how do you address this? The first problem is we need to go to the sources of corruption. And usually the sources of corruption are two: high inequality and a badly designed government, right? And until you address those two, inequality and the badly designed government, I think corruption is going to be sort of rampant. I mean, it's going to be very hard to change that. Then we have to be careful about costs and benefits of corruption. One of the problems we have in many cases, and I guess somehow it's what you're talking about, is from the viewpoint of the voters, sometimes corruption produces short-run benefits. And so people don't care because, okay, there's some corruption, but I'm getting some benefits, you know, because I'm getting, you know, I'm getting a hospital, I'm getting a school. Yes, the politician is getting some bribe, but, you know, there's some construction, there's some jobs. And so you don't think about the costs, you just think about the benefits. Unfortunately, this is a rational choice, consistent. I mean, you're just saying, I'm doing a cost-benefit analysis, and I care about the benefits in the short run. I don't care about the cost in the long run. So this is way problematic. Of course, I think some of the problems we have is that international organizations have not been very helpful, the IMF, the World Bank, because they would be the ones that could do something about this. Many times they actually go to the countries and actually make it worse by bribing the politicians and by, you know, creating conflicts of interest. I don't believe that, let me just put, I was reading a paper about this. I don't believe in these big campaigns where one famous prosecutor decides to go after all the politicians. This happens in many countries. I don't know if it has happened in India, happened in Brazil, happened in China, actually happened too, that someday one big prosecutor says, I'm going after these guys and we're going to get rid of these guys. The problem with this, first, I always suspect the motivations of the prosecutor. I mean, we've seen the case in Brazil. The prosecutor ended up being a politician too. So there's always this problem here. The second is, if we have systemic structural reasons for this corruption, I don't think replacing politicians is the answer. Yes, we can read of these people, but somebody else will come in and do the same. So I think we need to think about the structural reasons for this corruption. There's one last issue, which is the extent to which the corruption was always there. It's the middle class that has changed their perceptions and their preferences. That is, the corruption is not new. The corruption was always there. It's just that certain practices were tolerated 40 years ago and they're not tolerated now by the middle class. And so if that's what's going on, then it's a change of perceptions of the middle class. And what we need is to empower this middle class, because they are the ones who are upset about this. I mean, a lot of what we see in the United States and we call lobbying, it's just legalized corruption. I mean, there's no other way to explain this. It's legalized corruption. Why is this now more controversial? Because we changed our social values. Things that we thought were okay in the 1960s are not okay now. And and you can hear former President Trump complaining about that, saying, whatever I'm doing, other people were doing. So why are you upset now? I mean, why are you upset with me and not with other people? Well, because some of these things look wrong now, and apparently they didn't look wrong in 30 or 40 years. So there may not be any change in the economics, in the structure. It's a change of perceptions. And again, I think perceptions are important, obviously, but then the solution, in my view, is to empower the middle class that has changed its perceptions. Sorry, Suha, I don't have a better answer, because if I had, again, I would be making millions in going to India and advising the government how to do this. So I don't really have a solution. I'm just saying we have to be careful. Are we changing reality? Is corruption really changing, or it's the perception of corruption that is changing? The fact that we tolerated certain behaviors that we don't tolerate now. And if that's perceptions, then I think the solution is to empower the middle class and make this middle class to participate more in government. Okay, someone raised their hand. Please just go ahead.
Yes, sir. Sir, I need your opinion on that. You said that democracy fosters economic growth, but not in the very linear manner. But sir, I have an observation that in India, at macro level, the shape of the democracy has not changed much. If I take the example of from 2014, the democracy has remained the same, but still the growth rate has changed drastically, and getting a very important task at macro level, like 100% vaccination at large population. So that sort of successful task that we have seen that government was able to, succeed in these areas. So the shape has not changed. Still, the democracy is able to deliver much better. So what is your opinion on that, sir?
So I think these are complicated discussions, because unfortunately, we do not have India with democracy and next door India without democracy, and then we can compare and see which is doing better. I mean, we don't have a counterfactual. So as economists, our problem is always what sort of comparisons can we make? Now, I know for those of you who are more into macroeconomics and development economics, that people now have this method, this synthetic control method, where you try to create counterfactuals statistically, and you try to create a synthetic India without democracy to try to compare to the real India. But of course, these are all statistical tricks. I mean, these are sort of artifacts of our research. They do not exist. So it is always very hard to really come up with an answer that tells us once and for all what is due to democracy and what is due to other cultural, social, economic variables. Now, I think one point you made, which is very important, is the idea that democracy delivers results. And I think that's a good way to think about this, is as long as democracy delivers some public goods and some results that keep people reasonably happy, then I think democracy as a system works. The problem is when it stops delivering these results, right? And if we are seeing some sort of democratic backsliding around the world, and this concept of democratic backsliding has become popular, I mean, the explanation has to be that a certain percentage of the voters thinks democracy is not delivering on its promises. Now, we could say that's because people are mistaken. That's because people have asymmetric information. That's a different issue. But the reasons would be that some part of the population thinks that an alternative model, like some authoritarian regime, would deliver more public goods. I still believe that in a non-linear way, democracy does foster growth. That is, I do not believe that authoritarian regimes are stable in the long run. I think an authoritarian regime is like a cartel. It's not stable in the long run. It could be stable in the short run, but in the long run, it includes the forces of destruction of the regime. And if that's the case, I think democracy in a non-linear way, as I was saying, in a non-linear way, is still better for economic growth because it's more sustainable in the long run. And so if you were asking me to go to a government and make some policy recommendations, I would not recommend to be an authoritarian state, because I think an authoritarian state, you have countries like Cuba, which has been authoritarian for 60, 70 years. You have North Korea, which has been authoritarian for 80 years. But I still think, on average, if you look around the world, democratic regimes are tentatively more stable than authoritarian regimes. Because an authoritarian regime, my view, is a regime about allocating rents to keep the supporters of the regime happy. The military, the church, the aristocracy, the plutocracy, whatever you think it's the groups that support the authoritarian regime. You need to keep them happy with rents. Now, rents at some point will be problematic. And so that's why I think an authoritarian regime includes the seeds of its own destruction, because at some point it will not produce enough rents to keep all the groups happy, and so some group will be unhappy, and this will lead to the fall of the authoritarian regime. Now, the fall of an authoritarian regime could be followed by another authoritarian regime. It does not need to be democracy. But I think authoritarian regimes have their seeds of destruction because of the allocation, in this case of the misallocation of talent and rents. Okay, a lot of questions here in the chat. Let me try to go over some of them. Well, I mean, again, I think before we study corruption, we need to define corruption, right? Because first of all, obviously, if you're a very poor country, there will be very limited corruption because there's not a lot to corrupt. But in a very poor country, if everyone is very poor, you're also a very equal country because everyone will be equally poor. So yes, in a way, corruption is related to economic growth because economic growth will create inequality, at least in the early stages. That's what we saw in the 20th century, in the early 20th century. But then, of course, there's many types of corruption. I mean, a lot of corruption is bypassing the law or regulations. It's bribes to get construction permits. It's bribes to get contracts, procurement contracts. Now, some of that corruption could actually be helpful if the law is too rigid and too bad. So that's why we have to be careful when we talk about corruption. And what is corruption doing? Is doing just misallocation of talent, or is actually correcting bad regulations and bad laws that were just too rigid or too inflexible to start with? So we have to be careful. And that's why I think when we go into discussions of corruption, we should sort of narrow down and be more specific about what sort of corruption we're talking about. So the notion that democracy is more inclusive, yes, but if you look at the data by VDAM, and then this is more sort of political science than law and economics, but a lot of democracies are not that very inclusive. So we have to be careful the extent to which inclusiveness is part of a democratic concept, because again, it will depend very much also on, you know, big countries versus small countries, very homogeneous countries versus very heterogeneous countries. It's obviously easier to have a more inclusive democracy in a small country with a very homogeneous population. But that's not going to be very interesting because it's basically everyone is the same in a very small country. So if you look at a country like Luxembourg or I don't know, the tiny countries in Europe, Monaco or Liechtenstein or any of these small countries, they're very inclusive, but they're also very small countries. And so I don't think we can infer a lot from there. Definition of corruption. No, I mean, I would say the other way around. We need to understand what definition of corruption we are having here. Also, because if some countries legalize corruption and other countries don't, if you don't have a good definition, you may end up making wrong comparisons, right? In India, I suppose if a judge uses his money or her own money to get a promotion to the Supreme Court, that would be corruption and illegal. But in the United States, as you know, judges can use their money and can actually use sponsoring to get elected to state Supreme Courts. So in the US, using your own money to get a job at the state Supreme Court is not illegal. In fact, it's regulated and it's perfectly legal. So we need to be careful because something that we call corruption in one country may actually be just regulated in the other country. And then we would be saying, oh, this country is very corrupt, whereas the other country has no corruption because we don't have any statistics on corruption. So we have to be careful what we compare. Yeah, go ahead. Someone has the hand up, so.
Yeah, hello, sir. Actually, my question was, given the dynamic nature of constitutional law and evolving economic realities, what strategies can be applied, can be employed to ensure that economic analysis remains relevant and adaptable to changing circumstances?
So I think your question has two different answers. If you're talking at the level of academic legal policy level, that is at the level of some policy discussion, I think economics is useful. But as we also change economics, remember the economics we're talking today is not the same as a science, is not the same as 40 years ago. So you also need to adopt the science of economics, not just the jargon. I mean, you need to adopt the science of economics. We need to understand problems that old theories could not explain. So I think you have changes on the side of the reality of the economy, the politics, but you also have changes on the side of the science that are important. I mean, maybe economists think we are not as exciting as computer sciences that are always changing, but I think we are an interesting science. I mean, we have changed. There are many things that we talk now that we didn't talk 20 years ago. Now, of course, when I did economics in my college degree, and you know, you cannot see, I have a lot of gray hair now, but I am not a very old man yet. But when I did my college degree, there was no behavioral. We didn't talk about behavioral. It didn't exist. Everything was rational choice, no behavioral. Now we introduced that and we say, okay, there's limitations, there's behavioral, this is important, right? I mean, we didn't talk about nudge policies, but here's another area where we could have a long seminar on nudge theory, nudge policies, what the government should be doing to help people. Is the government more rational than individuals? All these discussions, you know, Cass Sunstein, all these discussions out there. A different issue, I think, is at the policy level, at the reality level. And for example, I was once asked by a judge at the European Court of Justice, should we use law and economics when the legislator does not tell us to use law and economics, and when the defendants and the plaintiffs are not using law and economics? Right? Should a judge come in the court and say, you guys don't know any law and economics, but I'm going to use law and economics? It's a difficult question because judges are supposed to follow the law. If the legislator does not tell judges to do cost-benefit analysis, I mean, as an economist, I think the answer is yes, you should be doing cost-benefit analysis. But as a constitutional matter, it's problematic because a judge has to be mandated by the legislator. And if the legislator has not mandated that you should be using any sort of law and economics, I think it's at least controversial that should be done. So I think there you have a point that there will be situations where it's very unclear if law and economics should be used or how it should be used. I mean, the other question is, should a judge be using law and economics when the judge has not been trained in law and economics? I mean, isn't this a risk that he or she might be doing something that he has no idea? Just because he heard some, people like you talking about the Coase theorem. So here I'm going to cite the Coase theorem, but I never read Coase. I don't know what I'm talking about. It's just because, some of my friends told me that the Coase theorem now is a very popular thing to cite in a case. So yes, I mean, we have to be careful. There's a good notebook also by Anthony August. He was a professor of law and economics in Manchester. And he had this book where he has all these opinions by the English Court of Appeal, where they use economic arguments the wrong way, right? Where basically happens what I'm saying. The guy cites the Coase theorem, but actually cites wrongly and comes up with the wrong conclusion. Or the judge says, I'm going to do cost-benefit analysis, and then the judge does not do any sort of cost-benefit analysis. He does not even understand what are the costs here. So there's a lot of that, and that's a risk that we might have judges, I mean, even policymakers eventually, but we might have judges doing law and economics in the courts without actually knowing what they're doing because they don't really understand very well the concepts. So that is a problem, and that should be of a concern.
The legislatures and the judges?
Sorry, I didn't hear, Bernita. I didn't hear the question.
Like, so in this perfect world of law and economics, if the legislatures and judges complement each other.
Yes, but here's the difference. The legislators are in a better position because they usually have specialized staff. Legislators can have staff that helps them understanding cost-benefit analysis. Judges usually don't. I don't know in India, but even in the US, the clerks are not really economists. So then there's another thing, which is the extent to which a judge should care about the costs and benefits beyond the plaintiff and the defendant, right? Or should that be a concern for the legislator? Let me give you an example, which was a discussion in Brazil. Suppose you have a plaintiff and a defendant, and the case is someone is claiming, the case was actually someone claiming that when you become a widow, you should be entitled not to pay rent. That because you're a widow, you should be exempted from paying rent in your apartment. Now, here's the problem. One thing is the specific case of this widow and how we interpret the law in this specific context. But of course, there's a general consequence, because if I say, just to help this poor woman, that yes, because you're a widow, you don't have to pay rent, this is going to have a huge effect on the real estate market. Because from now on, no one wants to rent apartments to widows because they know the widow has a right not to pay the rent. Now, this is a problem for legislation, for sure. But is it a problem for the judge? Should the judge be concerned about the consequences beyond the specific plaintiff? The answer to this question is controversial. I mean, some lawyers would say yes, some lawyers would say no. The judge is supposed to decide about a particular case. It's not supposed to decide about the consequences that that particular case can have to the rest of society. And so this is the problem between the legislator and the judge. And I mean, you know, as an economist, my view, the judge should care about everything. But some lawyers, not all, some lawyers would argue, no, the judge should be concerned about this particular case. The judge should not be concerned about the repercussion this will have in society. It's the same problem of public opinion. Should the legislator care about the public opinion? Yes, because the legislator is a representative body and should represent the preferences of public opinion. Should the judge care about public opinion? Difficult question. There's a good paper at the Stanford Law Review by Cass Sunstein on should judges care about public opinion? It's a difficult issue because from a philosophical point of view, you should say no. Judges are about applying the law. The law is not made by public opinion. It's not made by opinion polls. It's not being made by social media. It's made by the legislator. So judges should apply the law independently of social media hysteria or independently of public opinion. But at the same time, as a pragmatic economist, you should also say courts cannot go against public opinion all the time. That would just be a problem if the decisions you're making as a court are systematically against public opinion, because this will reduce legitimacy and will reduce public trust on the courts. So it is problematic because on one hand, they should only apply the law independently of public opinion, but on the other hand, for legitimacy purposes, for public trust purposes, you cannot say courts should be applying the law with no regard for what people think about the cases of the law. And you can see the problem in the US, where the Supreme Court is now at the lowest public trust rate, below 20%. And this is a problem because this means that the current court, of course, is going against the progressive public opinion, but it's not getting the support of the conservative public opinion, because otherwise the rates would cancel off. It's clear that the court is piecing both sides, the progressive and the conservative side, and you cannot have a Supreme Court with 20% public trust, because that means people will be tempted not to obey the Supreme Court and to challenge the supremacy of the Supreme Court. So the question is sort of difficult and not easy to answer. Okay, there's a lot of questions about freebie policies, irrational economic decisions. Yes, but we need to handle them. I mean, in an ideal world, they don't exist because everything is rational choice theory. But of course, in reality, we have a lot of irrational economic decisions. I mean, by irrational, I would say bad cost-benefit analysis or plainly wrong cost-benefit analysis. And again, I think that has to do with the principal agent problems we have in democracy. The fact that there are significant agency costs and there are significant transaction costs. I don't think there's much more you can say beyond that. Okay, I think we're getting close to the concluding time. So I suggest tomorrow I'll go a bit more in detail on the opening chapters of Kutten and Ewan, and we'll try to conclude there, unless there's any other question. Okay, if not.
One last question, Professor, a very serious one.
Yes.
How many papers have you written?
Oh, I don't know.
Because on every topic, you know, it's a paper that you refer to, and
I don't
and
know.
your
I think the estimation is about 200, but I don't know. No, there are many things I have not written about, so there's still many things to write about. Don't worry.
Right, Professor?
I'm not retiring soon. I am not retiring soon. So
Not at all. Not at all. Not at all. Because you've left us with more questions than answers.
But that's the purpose of this talks, is to leave questions.
But we need answers, and you know, law and economics driven answers, because
No. You need questions. You need questions to think about answers. That's the purpose of the Socratic method. You raise the questions so people think about the answers.
all right.
But
Then,
you all guys also, but also you guys have a lot of questions, very good questions. So I'm very happy we have this sort of exchange.
right, Professor, you have a busy day ahead. So
Yes,
thank
it's
you.
my morning. Yes, and I'll see you tomorrow at the same time.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Professor. Have a nice day.
Thank you, ma'am.
Participants, just a second, if you could hold on. I had a request. Since we'll be concluding tomorrow, it'll be nice if I can request Ayush to, you know, kind of have a, I don't know, online photography session. So if all of you put your videos on, we can take this, make this memory and send it to Professor for all the value that it has. So our request, tomorrow we have what is this, online photography session. Small things that make people feel nice. We can do that, isn't it? Okay. Chalo then, good night, everybody. And 10th is your submission. So
Tomorrow is the
Get
last day for the
going.
submission.
so get going, isn't it? Right. Chalo. Good night.
Thank you, ma'am.
Good night, everybody.
Thank you,
Thank you so much. We still have 35 people at 8:40. That's so fantastic. Thank you very much. Good night. Means a lot. Thank you.
Good night, everyone.